Hello, dear listener. Before we journey together into the ancient world, I hope you'll indulge me in a moment of connection across time and space. How has your day been treating you? What hour finds you now? Is it dawn breaking gently through your window, afternoon light dancing on your walls, or perhaps the quiet embrace of evening settling around you? And from what corner of our vast world do you listen? Whether you're nestled in a bustling city or surrounded by countryside silence, you're about to travel back 5,000 years to witness humanity's first great experiment in civilization. If this journey through time speaks to your soul, I invite you to subscribe to Whispered Ages, where we explore the forgotten corners of human history with reverence and wonder. Now, let us begin our descent into the cradle of civilization itself. In the beginning, there were only rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates wound through southern Mesopotamia like silver threads spun by patient gods, their waters carrying silt rich as powdered gold from distant mountains. No cities rose from their banks yet. No temple spires pierced the endless sky. There was only water and wind and the whispered promise of something extraordinary stirring in the earth. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia they would one day call it, breathed with a rhythm older than memory. Each spring the twin rivers swelled with snowmelt from the Zagros mountains, flooding the plains with life-giving water that left behind layers of fertile mud when the floods receded. The desert winds carried stories across vast distances, stories of nomadic peoples who had begun to pause in their eternal wandering, who had begun to listen to what the land itself was trying to tell them. These were not yet the Sumerians. They were simply people, brown-skinned wanderers who had followed herds and seasons for countless generations, who knew the language of stars and the temperament of rain clouds. But something was changing in their hearts, something as subtle as the shift from winter to spring. Where once they would have moved on with the changing seasons, now they lingered by the riverbanks, studying the way water pooled in certain places, noticing how wild grains grew thicker in spots where the floods had been generous. The first settlements appeared like shy flowers after rain, small tentative clusters of reed huts and mud brick dwellings that seemed to emerge organically from the landscape itself. Eridu was among the earliest, a modest village that would one day claim to be the world's first city. But in those early days, it was nothing more than a gathering of families who had decided to plant their feet and grow roots as deep as the barley they were learning to cultivate. In Uruk, families built their homes where a gentle bend in the Euphrates created a natural harbour for reed boats. In Lagash, settlers discovered that a particular stretch of land between waterways seemed blessed with abundance, where date palms grew sweet and tall, and fish were so plentiful they could be caught with bare hands. In Nippur, something indefinable drew people to build their hearths. Perhaps it was the way the wind sang through the reeds there, or how the stars seemed brighter in that particular patch of sky. These early communities were bound not by walls or laws, but by something more fundamental, the shared understanding that the rivers were their lifeline, their mother, their teacher. They learned to read the water's moods, to predict its seasonal tempers, to work with its rhythms rather than against them. The floods that might have driven away their nomadic ancestors became a calendar, marking time in ways that would echo through all of human history. Around their fires at night, elders spoke in hushed tones of the river's consciousness, of how the water seemed to respond to human presence. They would say, "The Euphrates smiles when children play at her banks. The Tigris grows restless when no offerings are made." These were not superstitions, but observations born from intimate daily contact with forces greater than themselves. The rivers whispered to them, and they listened. As generations passed, the villages grew from handfuls of families to small communities of hundreds. They developed the first irrigation channels, modest ditches that guided river water to their barley fields. They learned to shape clay into vessels that could hold water, grain, and memory. They began to mark important events with small tokens, clay figures representing successful harvests, protective rituals, agreements between families. Trade routes emerged naturally, following the river's paths and connecting the scattered communities. A family in Eridu might offer their surplus fish for Uruk's fine pottery, while Lagash became known for skilled metalworkers who could shape copper into tools that lasted longer than stone. These exchanges were conducted with the solemnity of ritual, for they understood that commerce was a form of kinship, binding their separate communities into something larger than themselves. Religious practices developed organically around the mysteries they encountered daily. Why did the rivers flood at precisely the right times for planting? Why did certain plots of land yield abundant harvests while others remained barren? Why did some children possess an uncanny ability to predict the weather, while others could heal with their hands? The questions themselves became sacred, and the tentative answers formed the foundation of what would become humanity's first organised religion. Shamans emerged, men and women who seemed to communicate more directly with the invisible forces that governed their world. These early priests were part healer, part weather reader, part keeper of community memory. They conducted ceremonies by moonlight, their voices joining with the night wind to carry prayers across the water. They crafted the first primitive temples, circular platforms of packed mud, where the community could gather to acknowledge the powers that sustained them. By 4000 BCE, these river settlements had taken on a quality that transcended mere survival. They had become places where human consciousness was expanding, where people were beginning to see themselves not just as temporary occupants of the landscape, but as participants in some vast unfolding story. Children born in these villages grew up with a sense of place that their nomadic grandparents could never have imagined. They belonged to Eridu, to Uruk, to Lagash, to the land itself. Yet they remained small, these proto-cities, connected more by water and trade routes than by any central authority. Each community developed its own customs, its own relationship with the divine, its own way of reading the stars and honouring the dead. They were like islands of emerging consciousness in an ocean of wilderness, each one an experiment in what it might mean for humans to live together in permanent harmony with the natural world. The stage was set for transformation. The people, the land, the rivers and the gods were all in position. What came next would change the course of human history forever, but in those quiet decades before the cities truly rose, there was a piece that would be remembered in later ages as the time when humans first learned to listen to the Earth's deeper rhythms, when they first discovered that settling down didn't mean stopping growth. It meant putting down roots deep enough to support something magnificent. The rivers continue their ancient flow, carrying with them the dreams of a people on the verge of becoming something entirely new. The transformation came not with conquest or catastrophe, but like dawn breaking. Slowly, then all at once, until what had been unthinkable became inevitable. Eridu claimed the honour of being first, and perhaps it was. By 3800 BCE, what had begun as a modest riverside settlement had evolved into something unprecedented in human experience, a true city. Not merely a large village, but a complex organism where thousands of people lived in intricate interdependence, their lives woven together by systems of governance, religion, and culture that had never existed before. The secret lay in the temples. Where their ancestors had built simple platforms for community gatherings, the people of Eridu constructed something revolutionary. Massive mud brick edifices that rose like artificial mountains from the flat riverine landscape. These weren't merely places of worship, but nerve centres of an entirely new form of social organisation. The temple complex served as granary, courthouse, workshop, and spiritual sanctuary all at once, a physical manifestation of the belief that the sacred and the practical were inseparable. The oldest temple at Eridu, later rebuilt many times but always on the same sacred spot, was dedicated to Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and crafts. Local legend claimed that Enki himself had founded the city, that he had risen from the waters of the primordial ocean to teach humans the arts of civilization. Whether myth or memory, the story captured an essential truth. Eridu felt blessed, chosen, touched by divine favour in ways that elevated it above ordinary human settlements. Within the temple walls, a new class of people emerged, the priests who were also administrators, scribes, astronomers, and keepers of the community's accumulated wisdom. They developed the first systematic methods for managing irrigation networks that now stretched for miles in every direction, turning the harsh landscape into a garden of abundance. They coordinated massive public works projects, organised festivals that brought together people from dozens of surrounding villages, and began to record their activities on clay tablets using symbols that would evolve into humanity's first writing system. The development of writing was revolutionary in ways that wouldn't be fully appreciated for millennia. For the first time in human history, knowledge could be preserved across generations without relying on human memory. Wisdom accumulated rather than disappearing with each elder's death. Complex administrative systems became possible, allowing cities to grow far larger than any community that had come before. Life in these early Sumerian cities developed rhythms unknown to their nomadic ancestors. The day began before dawn with the sound of temple bells calling the faithful to morning prayers. Farmers headed to the fields guided by elaborate irrigation schedules maintained by the priest administrators, while craftsmen opened workshops where they perfected techniques for working copper, silver and gold into objects of both utility and beauty. The streets of Uruk, which by 3000 BCE had grown to rival Eridu in size and influence, buzzed with activity that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Professional bakers sold bread from specialised ovens. Brewers fermented barley into beer that was considered safer to drink than water. Potters shaped clay vessels with a precision and artistry that elevated craft to art. Merchants from distant lands brought obsidian from Turkey, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedarwood from Lebanon, trading these exotic materials for Sumerian barley, wool, and finished goods. Yet the most profound change was invisible: the development of complex social stratification. In nomadic societies, leadership had been temporary and task-specific. The best hunter led the hunt. The wisest elder settled disputes. But permanent settlement created the need for permanent institutions, and permanent institutions created permanent hierarchies. At the apex stood the priest-kings, figures who embodied both spiritual and temporal authority. They weren't merely political leaders, but were understood to be the gods' representatives on Earth, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that kept the rivers flowing and the harvests abundant. Below them developed layers of priests, scribes, skilled craftsmen, farmers and labourers, each group with defined roles and responsibilities. This stratification might have created resentment in other circumstances, but Sumerian society was bound together by a shared cosmology that made social roles feel like divine assignments rather than arbitrary inequalities. Everyone, from the highest priest to the humblest field worker, participated in a sacred drama that kept the universe in proper balance. Work became worship, and daily life became a form of prayer. The gods themselves reflected this ordered complexity. Where earlier peoples had honoured generalised nature spirits, the Sumerians developed a sophisticated pantheon of deities with specific personalities, domains, and relationships. Enki ruled fresh water and wisdom. His brother Enlil governed the air and was patron of Nippur. The goddess Inanna embodied both love and war, beauty and destruction, a divine reflection of life's inherent contradictions. These weren't distant, abstract deities, but active participants in daily affairs. Each city claimed a particular god as its patron, and the relationship between city and deity was understood to be reciprocal. The god protected and prospered the city, while the citizens provided offerings, maintained the god's temple, and conducted themselves in ways that honoured their divine patron. The temples grew accordingly, becoming the most impressive architectural achievements of their age. By 3100 BCE, the great temple of Anu in Uruk rose nearly 40 feet above the surrounding city, a mud-brick monument to human ambition and divine glory that could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian landscape. Its white-painted walls gleamed in the desert sun like a beacon, announcing to all who approached that this was a place where heaven and earth intersected. Inside these temples, rituals developed that would influence religious practice for millennia to come. Daily offerings of bread, beer and meat fed the god statue, which was treated as a living presence requiring care and attention. Seasonal festivals mark the agricultural calendar with ceremonies that could last for days, involving the entire population in dramatic reenactments of mythological events. The most significant of these was the sacred marriage ceremony, where the king or high priest symbolically wed the goddess Inanna to ensure the land's fertility for the coming year. These weren't mere symbolic gestures, but intensely meaningful rituals that bound the community together in shared purpose, and reminded everyone that human prosperity depended on maintaining proper relationships with divine forces. Innovation flowed from this spiritual foundation like water from a spring. Sumerian astronomers, motivated by the need to schedule religious festivals accurately, developed the first systematic observations of celestial movements. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. Their agricultural techniques, refined through generations of careful observation and religious devotion, could support population densities unimaginable in earlier eras. By 3100 BCE, Sumer had become a constellation of city-states, each one a miracle of human organization and divine inspiration. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kij. These names would echo through history as humanity's first successful experiments in urban civilization. They had solved the fundamental challenge that had limited human development for millennia: how to organize large groups of people in permanent settlements without descending into chaos or tyranny. Their solution was essentially spiritual. They had created societies where every person's role was understood to be sacred, where work served not just human needs, but cosmic purposes, where daily life was structured around the rhythm of religious observances that reminded everyone of their place in a larger divine order. Yet even as these cities flourished, the seeds of future challenges were already present. The same specialization that made complex civilization possible also created dependencies that could become vulnerabilities. The same social hierarchies that provided stability also concentrated power in ways that could lead to oppression. The same religious systems that unified communities also created the possibility of conflict between cities that served different gods. But in those remarkable centuries around 3100 BCE, as writing was born and cities rose and the first great ziggurats reached toward heaven, none of these future troubles dimmed the extraordinary achievement that was taking place along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Humanity had learned to build something larger than tribes, more permanent than empires, more meaningful than mere survival. They had built civilization itself. From the misty intersection of history and legend emerges a figure whose very existence embodies the transformation of Sumer from collection of city-states to conscious civilization. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, hero of humanity's first great epic, a man so remarkable that reality could not contain him, and he spilled over into myth. Was Gilgamesh a king who became a legend, or was he always a legend pretending to be one? The question haunts us across millennia, for in him we glimpse something profound about how human consciousness was evolving in those crucial centuries around 2900 BCE. The archaeological record confirms his existence. King Gilgamesh, of the first dynasty of Uruk, builder of walls, patron of arts, conqueror of neighbouring cities. Yet the stories told about him transcend any mortal accomplishment, reaching toward truths too large for history alone to hold. The epic that bears his name, preserved on clay tablets discovered thousands of years after his death, reads like humanity's first attempt to grapple with the ultimate questions. What does it mean to be human? How do we face mortality? What constitutes a life well lived? These weren't abstract philosophical inquiries, but urgent personal questions for a civilization that had achieved so much, yet remained vulnerable to forces beyond human control. In the epic, Gilgamesh begins as a king drunk on his own power, oppressing his people through arrogance and excess. The gods, disturbed by his behaviour, create Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals, innocent of civilization's refinements, but possessing natural wisdom that the sophisticated king has lost. When Enkidu and Gilgamesh finally meet, they fight fiercely before recognizing in each other a kindred spirit. Their friendship becomes the emotional center of the story, representing the reconciliation between nature and culture that was essential to Sumerian civilization. Together they undertake heroic adventures, slaying the monster Humbaba in the cedar forests of Lebanon, killing the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar. But when Enkidu dies as punishment for their defiance of divine will, Gilgamesh is confronted with the reality of death, not as abstract concept, but as personal loss so devastating it transforms his understanding of existence itself. The remainder of the epic follows Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, his journey to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood that once destroyed the world. In this ancient tale, we find echoes that would resonate through later traditions, the flood narrative that would influence Hebrew scripture, the quest for eternal life that would drive countless later heroes, the hard-won wisdom that mortality gives meaning to human achievement. But the epic's deepest insight comes in its conclusion. Gilgamesh learns that immortality is reserved for the gods alone, that human greatness lies not in transcending mortality, but in accepting it while still striving to create something lasting. He returns to Uruk not with the secret of eternal life, but with a deeper understanding of what makes life precious, relationships, achievements that outlast the individual, the responsibility to serve something greater than oneself. This wasn't merely entertainment, but sacred literature, recited in temples and passed down through generations as a guide to living. In Gilgamesh, the Sumerians explored what it meant to be civilized, not just to live in cities, but to grapple consciously with the human condition, to find meaning in mortality, to balance individual desire with collective responsibility. The historical Gilgamesh ruled during a period when Sumerian civilization was reaching new heights of achievement and complexity. The cities that had begun as collections of mud brick houses around temple complexes were transforming into magnificent urban centres that demonstrated humanity's capacity for monumental construction and sophisticated organisation. Uruk, Gilgamesh's city, had grown to encompass nearly 1,500 acres, home to perhaps 50,000 people, a population density unimaginable in earlier ages. The city was dominated by two great temple complexes, the Inanna precinct dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, and the Anu Ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that rose like a man-made mountain from the urban landscape. These ziggurats represented a revolution in human construction technique and spiritual ambition. Built in stages over generations, they required coordinated effort from thousands of workers and sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. More than mere buildings, they were theological statements made in mud, brick and bitumen, physical assertions that humans could create structures worthy of divine residence. The word ziggurat meant to build high, and these tower temples literally reached toward heaven, their ascending platforms creating a stairway between earth and sky. At their summits, small shrines housed the statues of patron deities, tended by priests who conducted daily rituals that maintained the cosmic order. The ziggurats were visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian landscape, announcing each city's divine patronage and human achievement to all who approached. During Gilgamesh's era, Sumerian society developed the institutional frameworks that would define urban civilization for millennia to come. Legal systems emerged to manage the complex relationships between thousands of people living in close proximity. Property rights were codified, contracts were recorded on clay tablets, courts were established to resolve disputes. These weren't arbitrary impositions, but practical necessities for communities that had grown too large and complex for informal governance. The development of law represented another uniquely Sumerian innovation, the idea that human behaviour should be regulated by consistent principles rather than the arbitrary will of rulers. Early legal codes, preserved on cuneiform tablets, dealt with everything from trade disputes to marriage contracts to punishment for crimes. Justice wasn't perfect, social status clearly influenced legal outcomes, but the very concept that rulers should be bound by law represented a revolutionary constraint on power. Craft specialization reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Sumerian metalworkers developed techniques for creating bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder and more durable than either pure metal. Their skill in working gold and silver produced jewellery and ceremonial objects of extraordinary beauty, many preserved in royal tombs that testify to the wealth and artistic achievement of Sumerian civilization. The Standard of Ur, discovered in the royal cemetery and dating to around 2600 to 2400 BCE, illustrates the complexity of Sumerian society through intricate inlaid scenes of war and peace. One side shows soldiers marching in formation, war chariots trampling enemies, prisoners being led before the king. The other depicts a peaceful banquet, with figures carrying fish, cattle, and other offerings while musicians provide entertainment. Together the two sides present a civilization capable of both organised warfare and refined cultural life. This duality, the capacity for both conflict and creation, characterised Sumerian cities during the age of early kings. While they achieved unprecedented heights of artistic and intellectual achievement, they also developed the world's first professional armies. The same organisational skills that made possible massive construction projects and complex irrigation systems also enabled warfare on a scale unknown to earlier peoples. Intercity conflicts became common as individual city-states competed for control of trade routes, water rights, and agricultural land. These weren't casual raids, but systematic campaigns involving thousands of soldiers equipped with standardised weapons and organised in disciplined formations. Kings like Gilgamesh built their reputations through military success as much as through building projects or religious devotion. Yet war, like everything else in Sumerian civilization, was understood within a religious framework. Battles were fought not merely for material gain, but to demonstrate divine favour, to prove which city's patron god was more powerful. Victory brought glory not just to human commanders, but to the deities they served, while defeat was interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure, requiring spiritual as well as military response. The institution of kingship itself was evolving during this period, from temporary war leadership to permanent political authority. Early Sumerian kings were chosen during crises and expected to relinquish power when the crisis passed. But as warfare became more common and administration more complex, temporary leadership proved inadequate. Kings began to claim permanent authority, justified by divine sanction rather than mere human consensus. This transformation of leadership from temporary to permanent, from consensual to hereditary, represented one of the most significant political developments in human history. It established patterns of governance that would persist for millennia, but it also created tensions between individual ambition and collective welfare that would challenge every subsequent civilization. The reign of Gilgamesh, whether historical or legendary, symbolised both the achievements and the problems of this new form of social organisation. A king powerful enough to build great monuments and lead successful military campaigns, but also capable of oppressing his own people. A hero who could defeat monsters and gods, but who struggled with the fundamental human limitation of mortality. A ruler who embodied the possibilities and the dangers of concentrated power. In the epic that preserved his memory, Gilgamesh's greatest achievement wasn't military victory or architectural wonder, but the wisdom gained through loss and struggle. He learned that true kingship involved service rather than domination, that lasting greatness came through leaving behind achievements that benefited others, that mortal life gained meaning precisely through its limitations. These insights, preserved in humanity's first great work of literature, represented more than individual wisdom. They reflected the collective learning of Sumerian civilization as it grappled with the challenges of urban life, complex social organisation, and concentrated power. In Gilgamesh's journey from tyrannical ruler to wise king, we see civilization itself learning to balance individual achievement with collective welfare, temporary power with lasting responsibility. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2350 BCE, the foundations had been laid for everything that would follow in human political development. Kings ruled by divine right but were expected to serve divine purposes. Law constrained even royal power. Professional armies protected but also potentially threatened civilian populations. Cities competed but also cooperated through trade and diplomatic relationships. The Age of Gilgamesh had established the framework within which human societies would operate for the next 5,000 years. Whether hero or tyrant, man or myth, he represented the emergence of individual consciousness powerful enough to shape civilization itself, and the responsibility that came with such power. Sumer in its classical age was not a nation but a symphony. Dozens of independent city-states playing their own themes while contributing to a greater harmonious whole. Each city pulsed with its own rhythm, honoured its own patron deity, developed its own character and customs, yet all were unmistakably Sumerian, bound together by shared language, religion, and the constant flow of trade along the great rivers that had given birth to their civilization. Arose beside the Euphrates like a jewel of commerce and craftsmanship, its merchants' vessels sailing downriver to the Persian Gulf and beyond, returning with treasures from the Indus Valley and the mountains of Anatolia. The royal cemetery of Ur, discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, revealed the extraordinary wealth and sophistication of this period. Golden helmets, elaborate headdresses, lyres decorated with bulls' heads crafted from precious metals and lapis lazuli. The famous burial of Queen Puabi, surrounded by dozens of attendants who had drunk poison to accompany her into the afterlife, testified to both the magnificence and the sometimes dark devotion of Sumerian court culture. Lagash flourished in the fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates, becoming renowned for its innovative rulers and ambitious building projects. Under King Anatum around 2450 BCE, Lagash briefly dominated much of southern Mesopotamia, commemorating its victories on the Stele of the Vultures, a limestone monument depicting the king leading his soldiers into battle, while vultures feast on the corpses of defeated enemies. Yet Lagash was remembered not only for warfare but for the reforms of Urkagina, who around 2350 BCE proclaimed the world's first known declaration of social justice, limiting the power of priests and nobles while protecting the rights of ordinary citizens. Kish, in the north, claimed to be the seat of kingship itself, the place where divine authority first descended from heaven after the Great Flood. Its kings bore the title King of Kish, which other rulers adopted to legitimize their own authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kish was indeed one of the earliest seats of centralized power in Mesopotamia. Its strategic location at the narrowest point between the Tigris and Euphrates making it a natural centre for trade and political control. Nippur held perhaps the most sacred position among Sumerian cities, home to the great god Enlil, lord of the air and wind, whose approval was essential for any king's legitimacy. Unlike other cities, Nippur rarely sought political dominance through military conquest, instead wielding influence through its religious authority. Kings from across Sumer came to Nippur to receive Enlil's blessing, making offerings to the god and seeking the priestly endorsement that would validate their rule in the eyes of their subjects. This multiplicity of power centres created a dynamic political landscape, unlike anything seen before in human history. Peace was indeed rare, as the story acknowledges, but the constant warfare shouldn't be understood as primitive chaos. Instead, it represented the growing pains of humanity's first experiment in complex multi-state politics, complete with shifting alliances, diplomatic marriages, trade agreements, and territorial disputes that would become familiar patterns in later civilizations. The wars themselves were often limited affairs, more like elaborate tournaments than total conflicts. Cities rarely sought to destroy each other completely. They were too valuable as trading partners and too necessary as components of the larger Sumerian ecosystem. Instead, conflicts typically aimed to establish temporary dominance, secure favourable trade terms, or resolve disputes over water rights and agricultural land. Water was, inevitably, at the centre of most conflicts. The elaborate irrigation systems that made Sumerian civilization possible required constant maintenance and careful coordination between communities that shared river water and canal networks. A city that diverted too much water for its own fields could devastate its neighbours' harvests, leading to conflicts that had both practical and religious dimensions, for interfering with irrigation was seen as disrupting the divine order that governed the flow of life-giving water. Yet even amid this political fragmentation and periodic warfare, Sumerian civilization achieved innovations that would revolutionize human life. The wheel, perhaps invented around 3500 BCE, transformed both transportation and pottery making. Early Sumerian wheels were solid wooden discs, heavy but effective for moving goods over the flat Mesopotamian landscape. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian craftsmen had developed lighter spoked wheels that made possible the war chariots that dominated ancient battlefields for over a millennium. The plough represented an equally revolutionary advance in agricultural technology. Earlier farming had relied on simple digging sticks and hoes, limiting the amount of land a family could cultivate. The Sumerian plough, pulled by oxen and capable of breaking tough sod, multiplied agricultural productivity and made possible the surplus food production that supported increasingly large urban populations. Innovations in plough design continued throughout the period, with bronze-tipped ploughshares and improved harnesses increasing efficiency and reducing the labour required for field preparation. Mathematical achievements during this period were equally impressive. The Sumerian base 60 system gave us the 60-minute hour, the 60-second minute, and the 360-degree circle, mathematical conventions we still use today. Sumerian scribes developed sophisticated techniques for calculating areas, volumes, and proportions, essential skills for managing irrigation projects, dividing agricultural land, and planning construction projects. Their mathematical texts, preserved on thousands of cuneiform tablets, reveal a level of abstract thinking that wouldn't be matched in the Western world until the Greek Golden Age 2 millennia later. But perhaps the most significant achievement of this period was the flourishing of religious and literary culture centered around the goddess Inanna, known to later peoples as Ishtar. Inanna embodied the paradoxes of Sumerian civilization itself. She was goddess of both love and war, fertility and destruction, beauty and terrible power. Her primary cult center was at Uruk, but her worship spread throughout Sumer and beyond, making her one of the first truly international deities. The hymns and stories devoted to Inanna represent some of humanity's earliest explorations of complex psychological and spiritual themes. In the famous poem Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, the goddess journeys to the realm of the dead, is killed by her sister Ereshkigal, and is eventually resurrected, a mythological pattern that would influence resurrection narratives throughout the ancient world. The story explores themes of death and renewal, the necessary balance between light and dark aspects of existence, and the transformative power of confronting one's shadow. Equally remarkable are the love poems between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi, which celebrate sexual passion with a frankness and beauty that surprised early archaeologists. These weren't merely erotic literature, but sacred texts that understood physical love as a manifestation of divine creativity, sexual union as a participation in the cosmic forces that sustain life. The annual sacred marriage ceremony, in which the king symbolically wed the goddess, renewed the land's fertility and reaffirmed the connection between human sexuality and divine power. She ruled love and war with equal grace and equal fury. This integration of seemingly opposite forces, love and violence, creation and destruction, sexuality and spirituality, characterized Sumerian culture at its height. Their gods weren't distant moral paragons, but complex personalities who reflected the full range of human experience. Their kings were expected to be both fierce warriors and wise administrators, capable of leading armies into battle and managing complex diplomatic relationships. Their cities combined magnificent temples with bustling marketplaces, sacred precincts with residential neighbourhoods, where ordinary families lived lives that were both practical and deeply spiritual. Trade networks during this period extended far beyond Mesopotamia, creating what might be considered the world's first global economy. Sumerian merchants established trading posts from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, exchanging barley, wool, and manufactured goods for metals, precious stones, and exotic materials unavailable in the river valleys. The discovery of Harappan seals in Mesopotamian cities and Mesopotamian artifacts in the Indus Valley demonstrates the remarkable reach of these early commercial networks. This international trade brought more than material goods. It facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that enriched Sumerian civilization while spreading Sumerian innovations to distant lands. The cuneiform writing system was adapted for other languages. Sumerian mathematical techniques influenced calculation methods across the ancient world, and Sumerian religious concepts can be traced in the mythologies of peoples from Egypt to India. Craft specialization reached extraordinary levels during this period. Sumerian jewelers created works of art that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. Their techniques for working gold, silver, and precious stones, demonstrating both technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication. Textile workers developed dyeing and weaving techniques that produced fabrics coveted throughout the ancient world. Brewers perfected the production of beer, which was safer to drink than water, and became a daily staple for all social classes. Perhaps most remarkably, this period saw the emergence of what might be called professional artists, individuals whose full-time occupation was creating objects of beauty, rather than merely functional items. The magnificent standard of the elaborate harps and lyres found in royal tombs, the carved cylinder seals that served as personal signatures, all testify to a civilization wealthy enough to support pure artistic creation and sophisticated enough to appreciate it. By 2300 BCE, as this classical period of Sumerian independence drew to a close, the city-states had created a form of civilization that balanced unity with diversity, competition with cooperation, individual achievement with collective welfare. They had demonstrated that humans could live together in large numbers without sacrificing creativity or spiritual depth, that cities could be both economically productive and culturally magnificent, that political independence could coexist with cultural unity. The end would come not from internal collapse but from external conquest, as Sargon of Akkad unified the region under foreign rule. Yet even under conquest, the achievements of the classical Sumerian period would endure, providing the foundation for all subsequent Mesopotamian civilization, and, through various channels of transmission, influencing the development of human culture across the globe. In those centuries of creative competition between proud city-states, humanity had learned to build not just cities, but civilizations, complex cultural systems capable of preserving and transmitting knowledge, supporting artistic achievement, and providing meaning and identity to millions of people. The legacy of classical Sumer would echo through history, reminding later ages that human beings are capable of creating societies that are both practically successful and spiritually fulfilling. The transformation came not as liberation but as eclipse, the shadow of a new power falling across the ancient cities of Sumer, dimming but never extinguishing the light that had burned there for over a millennium. Sargon of Akkad emerged from the northern regions around 2334 BCE, like a force of nature given human form. His origins were shrouded in legend. Some said he had been found as an infant floating in a reed basket on the Euphrates, raised by a gardener, blessed by the goddess Ishtar with a destiny that would reshape the known world. Whether myth or memory, the story captured something essential about this extraordinary figure who had become history's first true empire builder. The Akkadians were Semitic peoples who had long lived alongside the Sumerians, adopting their urban lifestyle and sophisticated culture while maintaining their own language and tribal traditions. Under Sargon's leadership, they became something unprecedented, a unified military force capable of conquering and governing vast territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon's conquest of Sumer was methodical and devastating. One by one, the proud city-states that had maintained their independence for centuries fell to his disciplined armies. Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, the cities whose very names had become synonymous with civilization itself, found their walls breached, their kings deposed, their temples plundered. Yet even in conquest, Sargon demonstrated a political sophistication that set him apart from mere warlords. Rather than destroying the cities he captured, he incorporated them into a larger imperial system that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. The Akkadian Empire represented humanity's first experiment in multi-ethnic, multilingual imperial governance. Sargon understood that lasting rule required more than military dominance. It demanded cultural integration and administrative efficiency on a scale never before attempted. He appointed Akkadian governors to rule conquered cities, but retained many Sumerian officials in subordinate positions, recognizing their expertise in urban administration and their influence with local populations. Most remarkably, he embraced rather than suppressed Sumerian culture. Akkadian scribes learned to write cuneiform, adapting the script to their Semitic language while preserving thousands of Sumerian texts. Akkadian artists adopted Sumerian artistic techniques and religious iconography. Akkadian kings participated in traditional Sumerian religious ceremonies, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to the ancient traditions rather than foreign usurpers. Even under a foreign king, the old gods still watched the rivers. This cultural synthesis created something entirely new in human experience, a civilization that was simultaneously unified and diverse, capable of governing vast territories while preserving local traditions and identities. The Akkadian language became the lingua franca of diplomacy and trade throughout the ancient Near East. Yet Sumerian remained the language of scholarship and religious ritual, much as Latin would function in medieval Europe. Under Akkadian rule, Sumerian religious traditions underwent significant evolution. The goddess Inanna was identified with the Akkadian Ishtar, creating a more complex deity who embodied both Sumerian and Semitic religious concepts. Sumerian creation myths were retold with Akkadian protagonists, while Akkadian epic traditions incorporated Sumerian heroic figures like Gilgamesh. The result was a richer, more elaborate mythology that would influence religious thought throughout the region for millennia. Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled from 2254 to 2218 BCE, represented the height of Akkadian power and the most dramatic departure from Sumerian political traditions. He was the first Mesopotamian ruler to claim divinity during his lifetime, depicting himself on monuments wearing the horned crown previously reserved for gods. His famous victory stele shows him trampling enemies while his soldiers climb mountain paths, suggesting military campaigns that extended Akkadian influence far beyond traditional Mesopotamian boundaries. Yet this imperial grandeur came at a cost that would eventually prove fatal. The administrative demands of governing such a vast empire strained resources that had once been devoted to local infrastructure maintenance. The elaborate irrigation systems that had made Sumerian civilization possible required constant attention and repair, but imperial administrators focused on extracting tribute and maintaining military control rather than preserving the agricultural foundation of Mesopotamian prosperity. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a gradual decline in urban population and agricultural productivity throughout former Sumerian territories. Irrigation canals silted up from neglect. Fields were abandoned as farmers fled military conscription or tax collection, and the delicate balance between human activity and natural forces that had sustained Sumerian civilization for centuries began to break down. The empire's collapse, when it came around 2154 BCE, was as dramatic as its rise had been. A confederation of mountain peoples called the Gutians swept down from the Zagros Mountains, overwhelming Akkadian armies and sacking the imperial capital. Within a few years, the unified empire that had dominated Mesopotamia for nearly 2 centuries had fragmented into competing local kingdoms and city-states. Yet the Akkadian period left permanent changes that would influence all subsequent Mesopotamian history. The concept of universal empire, the idea that a single ruler could legitimately govern diverse peoples across vast territories, had been established and would inspire conquerors from Hammurabi to Alexander the Great. The synthesis of Sumerian and Akkadian cultures had created new forms of art, literature, and religious expression that enriched the cultural heritage of the region. Perhaps most importantly, the Akkadian period had demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of imperial ambition. On one hand, it showed that human societies could achieve unity and cooperation on an unprecedented scale, that cultural differences need not prevent political integration, that imperial administration could preserve and spread civilization rather than destroying it. On the other hand, It revealed how quickly imperial overstretch could lead to systemic collapse, how neglect of local infrastructure could undermine even the mightiest empire, how the pursuit of glory could blind rulers to the practical necessities of sustainable governance. The legacy of Akkadian rule was thus profoundly ambiguous. Sumerian cities had lost their political independence, but had seen their cultural influence spread across much of the known world. Sumerian religious traditions had been transformed, but had also transformed their conquerors, creating syncretic beliefs that were richer and more complex than either tradition alone. Sumerian political institutions had been subordinated to imperial administration, but had also provided the administrative expertise that made imperial governance possible. During the chaos that followed the Gutian invasions, some Sumerian cities managed to reassert their independence, suggesting that the old civic traditions had never been entirely extinguished. Local rulers in Lagash and Uruk began once again to build temples, commission artworks, and conduct the religious ceremonies that had defined Sumerian civilization for over a millennium. They wrote their inscriptions in Sumerian rather than Akkadian, consciously positioning themselves as inheritors of pre-imperial traditions. These Neo-Sumerian revival movements prepared the ground for what would become the final flowering of Sumerian civilization under the third dynasty of Ur. The period of Akkadian rule had been a long parenthesis in Sumerian history, a time when their cities had been governed by foreign powers, but when their deeper cultural traditions had been preserved, transformed, and ultimately strengthened through contact with other peoples and ideas. The Akkadian shadow had indeed dimmed the bright light of classical Sumerian independence, but it had not extinguished it. Instead, like starlight filtered through atmospheric disturbance, the light had been refracted and scattered, creating new patterns and possibilities that would illuminate the ancient world in ways the original Sumerian city-states could never have achieved alone. When Akkadian power finally collapsed, it left behind a Mesopotamian world that was more cosmopolitan, more culturally complex, more aware of its place in a larger regional system than it had ever been before. The Sumerians who emerged from nearly 2 centuries of foreign rule were not the same people who had been conquered by Sargon, but they were recognisably Sumerian, living proof that cultural identity could survive political subordination, that civilizational values could transcend the rise and fall of empires, that the human capacity for creating meaning and beauty was stronger than any conqueror's sword. Like dawn breaking after a long night, the third dynasty of Ur rose from the ruins of Akkadian collapse to orchestrate Sumerian civilization's final, magnificent symphony. Under the leadership of Ur-Nammu, who ascended to power around 2112 BCE, the ancient cities of Sumer experienced a renaissance that would create some of their most enduring achievements, while serving as a bittersweet farewell to over 2 millennia of Sumerian independence. Ur-Nammu was not merely a conqueror but a builder, not merely a king but a restorer of ancient traditions, filtered through the hard-won wisdom of imperial experience. Having witnessed how Akkadian rule had transformed Mesopotamian society, he understood that effective governance required both military strength and cultural legitimacy, both administrative efficiency and respect for local traditions. His dynasty would demonstrate that Sumerian civilization, far from being a relic of the past, remained capable of innovation and growth even in its twilight years. The first task was physical reconstruction. The irrigation systems that had sustained Sumerian agriculture for millennia had suffered severe neglect during the chaotic decades following Akkadian collapse. Canals had silted up, dikes had crumbled, and entire agricultural regions had reverted to desert. Ur-Nammu launched massive public works projects that employed thousands of workers in restoring and improving the water management infrastructure that remained the foundation of Mesopotamian prosperity. But this was reconstruction, with a difference. The engineers of the Third Dynasty incorporated lessons learned during the Akkadian period, designing more efficient canal systems and more durable construction techniques. They created standardized measurement systems that allowed for better coordination between different regions, and they established bureaucratic procedures for canal maintenance that would prevent future neglect. The result was an irrigation network more sophisticated than anything achieved during the classical Sumerian period. Urban reconstruction proceeded with equal ambition and greater resources than the ancient cities had ever possessed. The great ziggurat of Ur, whose ruins still dominate the landscape today, was Ur-Nammu's most spectacular achievement, a stepped pyramid rising over 200 feet above the surrounding city, its mud brick core faced with fired brick and bitumen, its access ramps designed to accommodate massive religious processions. Unlike earlier ziggurats, which had grown organically over centuries, Ur-Nammu's ziggurat was planned as a unified architectural statement, demonstrating both engineering mastery and religious devotion on an unprecedented scale. The ziggurat was more than monumental architecture. It was theology made manifest in brick and mortar. Its 3 levels represented the fundamental structure of Sumerian cosmology: the netherworld beneath, the earth in the middle, and the heavens above. At its summit stood a small temple where the moon god Nanna was believed to reside when visiting Earth, making the entire structure a bridge between divine and human realms. The building's orientation aligned with celestial movements tracked by Sumerian astronomers, whose observations had grown increasingly sophisticated during the Akkadian period. Literature flourished during this Neo-Sumerian Renaissance in ways that revealed both continuity with ancient traditions and creative adaptation to new circumstances. Scribes produced thousands of tablets containing hymns, prayers, myths, and administrative documents that provide our most detailed picture of Sumerian society. The hymns to various deities composed during this period display literary sophistication and emotional depth that surpass most earlier religious poetry, suggesting that Sumerian culture had been enriched rather than diminished by its encounter with Akkadian traditions. Of particular significance are the royal hymns that celebrated the achievements of Third Dynasty rulers, while placing their reigns within the broader context of Sumerian sacred history. These texts present kings not as divine figures in their own right, a rejection of Akkadian precedent, but as faithful servants of the gods, chosen to restore proper order after a period of foreign domination. The theological message was clear: legitimate rule derived from divine approval expressed through traditional Sumerian religious institutions. Legal innovation during this period produced humanity's first comprehensive law code, the Laws of Ur-Nammu, which predated the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. Written in Sumerian and inscribed on stone steles placed in public spaces, these laws established consistent principles for resolving disputes, punishing crimes, and regulating commercial transactions. The code's preamble explicitly connects legal justice with religious duty, stating that the king had been commissioned by the gods to establish justice in the land. Law carved in clay read aloud beneath temple light. The laws themselves reveal a society that had achieved remarkable sophistication in balancing individual rights with collective welfare. Property rights were carefully defined, contracts were legally enforceable, and even slaves possessed certain protections under the law. Women enjoyed relatively high status compared to later periods, with rights to own property, conduct business, and initiate divorce proceedings under specific circumstances. The code's emphasis on proportional punishment rather than arbitrary vengeance represented a significant advance in legal thinking. Economic prosperity during the Third Dynasty reached levels that would not be matched in Mesopotamia for centuries. Standardized weights and measures facilitated trade throughout the empire, while improved agricultural techniques and expanded irrigation increased food production. Craft specialization intensified, with workshops producing goods for both local consumption and long-distance trade. Archaeological evidence suggests that even ordinary families enjoyed material comforts unknown to earlier generations. International trade networks extended farther than ever before, with Sumerian merchants establishing commercial relationships with peoples as distant as the Indus Valley and the mountains of Afghanistan. The famous Sumerian merchant archives from Kanesh in Anatolia, dating to this period, reveal the sophistication of these trading operations, with complex credit arrangements, insurance agreements, and partnership contracts that would not seem out of place in modern commerce. Yet perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Neo-Sumerian period was its conscious cultivation of cultural memory. Third Dynasty rulers systematically collected and preserved ancient texts, commissioning new copies of literary works that might otherwise have been lost. They restored ancient temples using traditional architectural techniques, maintained religious festivals according to archaic rituals, and presented themselves as guardians of Sumerian tradition rather than innovators. This cultural conservatism reflected deep awareness that Sumerian civilization was entering its final phase. The demographic and linguistic changes that had begun during the Akkadian period continued, with Semitic-speaking peoples gradually becoming the majority population throughout Mesopotamia. Sumerian was increasingly confined to religious and scholarly contexts, understood by educated elites, but no longer spoken in the marketplace or the home. Rather than resist these changes, Third Dynasty rulers attempted to manage them in ways that would preserve the essence of Sumerian civilization, even as its political independence disappeared. They patronized scribal schools where Sumerian language and literature were taught to students regardless of ethnic background, ensuring that future generations would have access to ancient wisdom. They incorporated non-Sumerian peoples into the administrative system, while maintaining Sumerian bureaucratic traditions and governmental procedures. The military achievements of the Third Dynasty were equally impressive, though ultimately insufficient to prevent the civilization's final collapse. Ur-Nammu's successors, particularly Shulgi, who ruled for nearly half a century, created professional armies capable of maintaining order throughout their territories and defending against external threats. They fortified the empire's borders, established military colonies in strategic locations, and developed diplomatic relationships with neighbouring powers. Shulgi's reign represented the apex of Neo-Sumerian achievement. A patron of arts and learning who claimed to be literate in both Sumerian and Akkadian, he commissioned magnificent building projects, supported scholarly research, and maintained peace throughout his territories for decades. His royal hymns present him as the ideal Sumerian king, brave in war, wise in peace, devoted to the gods, and protective of his people. Yet even at its height, the Third Dynasty faced insurmountable challenges. Climate change was making agriculture increasingly difficult throughout Mesopotamia, with prolonged droughts reducing crop yields and forcing rural populations to migrate to cities. The Amorites, Semitic nomadic peoples from the western deserts, were pressing against the empire's borders in increasing numbers, seeking agricultural land and urban opportunities. Internal administrative costs were rising as the empire struggled to maintain irrigation systems across vast territories with declining tax revenues. The end, when it came around 2004 BCE, was swift and complete. Elamite armies from the Iranian highlands captured Ur and carried its last king, Ibbi-Sin, into captivity. The great ziggurat that had symbolized Sumerian resilience was plundered, its treasures scattered, its priests dispersed. Within a few years, the political entity that had been Sumer disappeared from history, its cities ruled by Amorite dynasties that would soon establish Babylon as the region's new centre of power. Yet the Neo-Sumerian revival had achieved something more lasting than political success. It had created a cultural legacy that would influence Mesopotamian civilization for over a millennium. The legal principles established by Ur-Nammu would be incorporated into later law codes. The literary works preserved by Third Dynasty scribes would be studied in schools throughout the ancient Near East. The architectural techniques perfected in building the Great Ziggurat would be employed in constructing temples and palaces for centuries to come. Most importantly, the Third Dynasty had demonstrated that cultural identity could transcend political boundaries, that civilizational values could survive military defeat, that the human capacity for creating beauty and meaning was stronger than any empire's armies. The Sumerians who lived through this final renaissance had witnessed their civilization's political death, but had also ensured its spiritual immortality. In preserving their heritage so carefully, in transmitting their wisdom so effectively, in creating monuments so enduring, they had achieved a victory more complete than any military conquest. They had made themselves eternal. The end of a civilization need not be violent. Sometimes it comes like evening, gradually, peacefully, with dignity and tact and wisdom preserved. Such was the twilight of Sumer, a fading so gentle that those who lived through it might have mistaken it for transformation rather than conclusion. After the fall of the third dynasty of Ur in 2004 BCE, the ancient cities continued to exist, but they existed differently. The Amorites, who now ruled much of Mesopotamia, were not destroyers, but inheritors, Semitic peoples who had absorbed Sumerian culture through centuries of contact and conquest. They rebuilt the shattered cities, restored the neglected temples, and reinstated the religious festivals that had defined Sumerian life for millennia. Yet something fundamental had changed in the relationship between rulers and the ruled, between present and past, between human ambition and divine purpose. The Amorite kingdoms that emerged from Sumer's political collapse were smaller, more pragmatic entities than the grand dynasties that had preceded them. Kings like Ishbi-Era of Isin and Naplanum of Larsa governed territories that corresponded roughly to the old city-states, but they lacked the imperial ambitions that had driven earlier rulers. Their inscriptions speak of practical achievements: canal repairs, temple renovations, defensive preparations, rather than cosmic mandates or divine missions. This more modest approach to governance reflected changed circumstances throughout the ancient Near East. The great empires of the third millennium had exhausted themselves through constant warfare and an administrative overstretch. Climate change was making agriculture more difficult across the region, while population movements were disrupting traditional trade routes and diplomatic relationships. Survival, not glory, became the primary concern of most rulers. Yet in this age of diminished expectations, Sumerian culture experienced a different kind of flourishing. Freed from the burden of imperial administration, cities could devote more resources to preserving and transmitting their ancient heritage. Scribal schools multiplied, producing scholars who specialized in copying and interpreting classical Sumerian texts. Libraries grew larger and more comprehensive, collecting not only contemporary works but also ancient literature that might otherwise have been lost. The most significant cultural development of this period was the gradual transformation of Sumerian from a living language into a sacred tongue. By 1800 BCE, few people spoke Sumerian in daily life, but it remained the language of scholarship, religious ritual, and legal documentation throughout Mesopotamia. Like Latin in medieval Europe or Sanskrit in classical India, Sumerian became a marker of education and cultural sophistication, studied by elites regardless of their ethnic background. This linguistic transformation actually strengthened certain aspects of Sumerian cultural influence. Because Sumerian was no longer associated with any particular political entity, it could serve as a neutral medium for scholarly communication across ethnic and political boundaries. Scribes in Babylon studied the same Sumerian texts as their counterparts in Assyria, creating a shared intellectual culture that transcended political divisions. Meanwhile, Babylon was rising. Under Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE, this previously minor city began to assert dominance over much of Mesopotamia through a combination of military skill, diplomatic acumen, and cultural synthesis. Hammurabi's famous law code, written in Akkadian but drawing heavily on Sumerian legal traditions, demonstrated how the new order would incorporate rather than replace the achievements of the past. The people no longer called themselves Sumerian, but the gods still answered to those names. Religious continuity proved stronger than political change throughout this period. The great temples of Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and other ancient cities continued to function as centres of worship, learning, and community life even under foreign rule. The gods worshipped there retained their Sumerian names and mythological associations, though their cults gradually incorporated elements from Amorite and other traditions. Inanna Ishtar remained among the most popular deities, her complex mythology enriched by new stories that reflected the changed circumstances of her worshippers. Enki-Ea continued to be honoured as the god of wisdom and fresh water, his cult centres maintained by priests who preserved ancient rituals while adapting them to contemporary needs. Enlil's temple at Nippur retained its position as a source of religious legitimacy for rulers throughout the region. This religious continuity provided stability and identity for populations experiencing rapid cultural change. People who could no longer speak the language of their ancestors could still participate in religious traditions that connected them to 5 millennia of continuous worship. Farmers who worked fields owned by Amorite landlords could still invoke Sumerian agricultural deities using prayers that had ensured good harvests for countless generations. Artistic traditions also demonstrated remarkable persistence during this transitional period. Sumerian iconographic motifs, the Tree of Life, the winged sun disk, the contest between heroes and wild beasts, continued to appear in artworks throughout Mesopotamia, though often executed in styles that showed influence from other cultural traditions. Cylinder seals remained popular forms of personal identification, their carved surfaces displaying mythological scenes derived from Sumerian literature even when owned by people of non-Sumerian ancestry. The gradual nature of Sumerian cultural absorption allowed for creative synthesis rather than simple replacement. Amorite rulers commissioned artworks that combined Sumerian religious themes with new aesthetic sensibilities. Babylonian poets retold Sumerian myths using narrative techniques derived from their own oral traditions. Scribes produced bilingual texts that preserved Sumerian originals while making them accessible to Akkadian-speaking audiences. Perhaps the most poignant symbol of this cultural transformation was the fate of the great ziggurat of Ur. After its plundering in 2004 BCE, the massive structure was gradually restored by a succession of rulers who recognized its importance as a symbol of legitimate authority in Mesopotamia. But each restoration reflected the architectural preferences and religious priorities of its sponsors, so that the building became a physical embodiment of cultural layering, fundamentally Sumerian in concept and construction, but modified by generations of foreign rulers who claimed its heritage as their own. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals communities that were simultaneously cosmopolitan and traditional, innovative and conservative. Urban populations included people of diverse ethnic backgrounds who nonetheless participated in recognisably Sumerian cultural practices. Rural areas maintained agricultural techniques and religious observances that had changed little since the 3rd millennium, while adapting to new political and economic circumstances. Trade continued to flow along routes established during the height of Sumerian power, though the goods and the merchants involved often differed from earlier periods. Sumerian crafts, particularly textiles, metalwork, and luxury items associated with religious ceremonies, remained highly valued throughout the ancient Near East, ensuring that Sumerian artistic traditions continue to evolve and influence other cultures. The scholarly tradition proved particularly resilient during these centuries of political transition. Libraries in cities like Sippar and Nippur continued to acquire and preserve texts from across the Mesopotamian cultural spectrum, creating collections that would eventually influence Greek philosophy, Hebrew scripture, and Islamic scholarship. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge developed during the Sumerian period provided the foundation for Babylonian scientific achievements that would revolutionize understanding of celestial mechanics and numerical calculation. Legal traditions showed similar continuity within change. While Hammurabi's code was written in Akkadian and reflected Amorite social priorities, it incorporated principles of justice and proportional punishment that had been fundamental to Sumerian law for centuries. Local courts throughout former Sumerian territories continued to apply legal precedents derived from ancient sources, ensuring that traditional concepts of property rights, contract enforcement and dispute resolution remained influential. By 1700 BCE, the transformation was essentially complete. The political entities that had been Sumerian city-states had been absorbed into larger kingdoms ruled by non-Sumerian dynasties. The Sumerian language survived primarily in scholarly and religious contexts. The population of Mesopotamia was increasingly Semitic in speech and culture, though many families could trace their ancestry to Sumerian origins. Yet in a deeper sense, Sumer had not disappeared, but had been universalized. Its cultural achievements had become the common heritage of all Mesopotamian peoples. Its religious insights had been incorporated into spiritual traditions that would influence monotheistic religions. Its legal principles had established patterns of justice that would persist for millennia. Its literary creations had become foundational texts for all subsequent Near Eastern civilization. The gentle decline of Sumer thus represented not failure but success of an extraordinary kind. A civilization that had begun as a collection of river villages had grown to encompass much of the known world, not through military conquest but through cultural influence. Its ideas, institutions and artistic creations had proved so valuable that successive conquerors had chosen to preserve and adapt them rather than destroying them. In losing their political independence, the Sumerians had achieved something more lasting. They had made their civilization eternal. Their cities might be ruled by foreign kings, their language might fade from daily speech, their gods might be worshipped under different names, but the essence of what they had created would continue to influence human development for thousands of years to come. The twilight of Sumer was thus also its apotheosis, the moment when a particular civilization transcended its historical limitations to become a permanent part of human culture. In fading so gracefully, in preserving so carefully, in influencing so profoundly, the Sumerians had achieved the closest thing to immortality that any human society can attain. It was as if the ancient world had left us a diary, waiting to be read by moonlight. In 1922, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating at a tell in southern Iraq, following local rumours of ancient treasures buried beneath centuries of accumulated sand and debris. What he discovered that winter would revolutionise understanding of human history and reveal a civilization that had been lost to memory for over 3,000 years. The Royal Cemetery of Ur yielded treasures that seemed to emerge from myth itself. Golden helmets worked with impossible delicacy, harps decorated with bulls' heads carved from lapis lazuli, elaborate headdresses that had adorned queens whose names had been forgotten when Rome was still a collection of hills beside the Tiber. But more precious than gold were the thousands of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that had preserved the voices of humanity's first literate civilization. Cuneiform tablets, it turned out, were everywhere in Mesopotamia, buried in the ruins of temples and palaces, discarded in ancient garbage dumps, tucked away in private homes and public buildings. Each tablet was a time capsule, preserving not just the grand narratives of kings and gods, but the intimate details of daily life 5,000 years ago. Shopping lists written by Sumerian housewives, love letters between separated spouses, school exercises where children practiced writing their names, legal disputes over property boundaries, medical prescriptions for ailments that still trouble humanity today. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from this archaeological treasury like a ghost walking out of the distant past, its 12 tablets preserving humanity's oldest great work of literature. When scholars first translated the flood narrative found on the 11th tablet, they realized they were reading a story that had influenced the Hebrew Bible, that had shaped countless later myths and legends, that had been copied and recopied for over 2 millennia before disappearing into historical darkness. But Gilgamesh was only the beginning. Archaeologists discovered hymns to Inanna that celebrated divine love with a passion and beauty that surprised Victorian scholars. They found mathematical texts that revealed the Sumerian origin of our 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle. They uncovered star charts that demonstrated sophisticated astronomical observation dating back to 3000 BCE. They translated administrative documents that provided detailed glimpses into economic systems of remarkable complexity and efficiency. Perhaps most remarkably, they found evidence of the Sumerian flood story, not just in literature, but in the archaeological record itself. Deep layers of silt in several Mesopotamian sites suggested massive flooding events that might have inspired the universal flood narratives found in cultures around the world. Whether these deposits represented the specific flood described in Sumerian myth remains debated, but their existence demonstrated that mythology often preserved genuine historical memory, that stories dismissed as fantasy might contain kernels of factual truth. The decipherment of cuneiform writing, achieved through the patient work of scholars like Henry Lowlinson and Georg Friedrich Grotefend in the 19th century, opened a window into human consciousness at its moment of historical emergence. For the first time, modern people could read the actual words written by the world's first urban dwellers, the first professional administrators, the first systematic observers of celestial movements, the first composers of epic poetry. What they discovered challenged many assumptions about human development and the relationship between civilization and progress. Sumerian society, far from being primitive, had achieved levels of social organisation, artistic sophistication, and intellectual achievement that in some respects surpassed later civilizations. Their legal codes were more comprehensive than many medieval law systems. Their mathematical knowledge was more advanced than that possessed by most Europeans during the Middle Ages. Their astronomical observations were more accurate than those made by many classical Greek scholars. The Sumerian invention of writing itself represented perhaps the most significant cognitive revolution in human history, after the development of language. The ability to record information permanently, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to communicate across vast distances and time spans, fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development. Every book ever written, every scientific discovery recorded, every historical narrative preserved, traces its ultimate ancestry to those first Sumerian scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed the extent to which Sumerian civilization established patterns that would influence all subsequent human societies. Urban planning principles first developed in Sumerian cities can be traced through Babylonian, Persian, Greek and Roman urban design. Legal concepts first articulated in Sumerian law codes influenced the development of jurisprudence throughout the ancient world and through various transmission routes helped shape modern legal systems. Religious ideas first formulated in Sumerian temples, the concept of divine law, the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority, the notion that moral behaviour has cosmic significance, profoundly influenced the development of monotheistic religions. Sumerian flood narratives, creation myths and redemption stories can be traced in the religious literature of peoples from Egypt to India, suggesting that Sumerian theological insights had a more profound and lasting impact than their political achievements. The rediscovery of Sumer also revealed the artificial nature of many traditional historical narratives that began human civilization with Egypt and Greece, while ignoring the Mesopotamian foundations upon which both cultures were built. Egyptian writing systems showed clear influence from Mesopotamian prototypes. Greek mathematical and astronomical knowledge derived significantly from Babylonian sources that ultimately trace back to Sumerian innovations. Even the Hebrew Bible, traditionally understood as a uniquely inspired text, contained numerous narrative elements that had clear Sumerian parallels and probable Sumerian origins. Contemporary scholars continue to make discoveries that illuminate the extent of Sumerian influence on human development. The Sumerian invention of the wheel revolutionized transportation and industry. Their development of bronze metallurgy provided the foundation for technological advancement throughout the ancient world. Their agricultural techniques, particularly in irrigation and crop management, established patterns of food production that sustained population growth for millennia. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent archaeological work has suggested that Sumerian civilization may have been more ancient and more influential than previously believed. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, show evidence of complex social organisation and monumental construction that may represent the earlier stages of the urban revolution that would culminate in Sumerian cities. DNA analysis of ancient populations suggests that Sumerian genetic influence spread far beyond Mesopotamia, carried by traders, migrants, and conquerors throughout the ancient world. The modern Middle East, scarred by conflict and political instability, often obscures the region's role as humanity's civilizational birthplace. Yet beneath the headlines and political controversies, archaeological work continues to reveal new dimensions of Sumerian achievement. Recent excavations have uncovered previously unknown cities, additional literary texts, and evidence of technological innovations that continue to influence human development long after Sumerian political independence had ended. Digital technology has revolutionized Sumerian studies, allowing scholars to create comprehensive databases of cuneiform texts, to use satellite imagery to locate previously unknown archaeological sites, and to employ advanced dating techniques that provide more precise chronologies of Sumerian development. Virtual reality reconstructions now allow anyone to walk through Sumerian temples and palaces, to experience something approximating the visual impact these monuments would have had on their original visitors. The Sumerian legacy extends far beyond historical influence into contemporary relevance. Their struggle to balance individual achievement with collective welfare resonates in modern debates about inequality and social justice. Their experience with environmental challenges, particularly soil salinization and climate change, provides insights relevant to contemporary environmental crises. Their experiments with urban planning and resource management offer lessons for modern cities, grappling with population growth and infrastructure limitations. Most profoundly, the Sumerian example demonstrates humanity's capacity for creative adaptation, for building complex societies that can preserve and transmit cultural achievements across millennia. Their civilization endured for over 3,000 years, influencing human development in ways that continue to shape contemporary life. Their literature still speaks to modern readers, their artistic achievements still inspire admiration, their intellectual innovations still provide foundations for scientific and mathematical knowledge. In recovering the Sumerian past, modern scholarship has also recovered something essential about human potential itself. The Sumerians were not superhuman figures, but ordinary people who, through cooperation, creativity and perseverance, created extraordinary achievements. Their cities rose from river mud, their writing emerged from simple record-keeping needs, their epic literature developed from community storytelling traditions. Yet from these humble origins they built something that transcended their immediate circumstances, something that connected them not only to their contemporaries, but to all subsequent human generations. In their clay tablets we read our own story, the story of people learning to live together in large numbers, to govern themselves justly, to create beauty that outlasts individual lives, to ask questions about existence that remain relevant across millennia. The echoes in the clay continue to sound, carrying across 5,000 years the voices of humanity's first urban dwellers, the first people to call themselves civilized, the first to dream of permanence in a world of constant change. In listening to those echoes, we hear not just the past but the future, the ongoing human project of building societies worthy of our highest aspirations, communities that can nurture both individual achievement and collective flourishing, civilizations that can endure not through force, but through the enduring power of human creativity and wisdom.